Hello. Hold on a second. Let me adjust the camera. At the lower. There we go. Hello, I'm Thal Smith, and today is going to be an interesting book review slash discussion. I'm going to review the Volsungs and the Niblungs, but before I do, I want to talk about one of the most interesting aspects of this. In case it's a Viking saga or Norse saga, Icelandic saga, however you want to call it, um, something along those lines. And I'm going to review it, but I want to talk about one of the most interesting aspects of the saga, which is its deep intrinsic influences throughout the entirety of Middle Earth in Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, even that Tolkien, referenced throughout all of those books. To do that, I should give a little background. For those of you who don't know, Tolkien was a professor at Oxford. He was a professor of English, basically old school English. We're talking ancient English. We're talking Canterbury Tales, Beowulf, the Icelandic sagas, etc. So he's very well versed in all of this. He knew a lot of the old languages. He did a whole translation of Beowulf, and I wouldn't be surprised if he did a few other translations of other ancient Western English sort of texts. He's very well versed in all of this, and he was a huge fan of it or nerd of it, however you want to call it. And it's a deep influence in all of Tolkien's work, very much so. Um, and a lot of it is shown in this saga called the Volsungs and the Niblings. I think I'm pronouncing that right, or Niblings. Niblings? I can't pronounce it right. But it's a fascinating story nonetheless, and Tolkien makes many references through it. Like there is a reference of the origin of how to put this. A lot of the stories we know in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit that's in the Lord of the Rings were influenced by a lot of the stories in here. That's what I was trying to say. So like we have a story that's influenced by the origin story of Gollum, which I'll read in a sec. And we also got an influence of a great big battle that ends with a great hero fighting off against a very powerful being. In the Volsung and the Niblings, it's the actual god Odin. Yeah, Odin. This is influenced by the Norse mythology. Um, so Odin, Loki, so on. And then there's of course, there's the sword that breaks because of that, and they keep the pieces of it, and eventually they manage to weld them back together. Yeah, sounding familiar, isn't it? And of course, there's a fight with a dragon, which is actually called a worm, which Tolkien actually used in a lot of the original text. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's um, one of the great influences of both Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit about sort of obsession of greed, especially in The Hobbit, this obsession with greed and how that can affect you. How one of the dwarves died because his obsession to hoard the greed, just like the dragon, very much influenced from the text. There's a line here that pretty much specifies what I mean by this in terms of its influence with the dragon in the book of the Hobbit and how it's used. And thou shalt find gold enough to suffice thee for all thy life days. Yet shall that gold be thy bane, and the bane of everyone whosoever owns it. So yeah, you can see how that influences the concepts of the ring in the Lord of the Rings. In fact, there is references of rings in the Volsungs and the Niblings, um, from the treasure hoard of the gold, which is won by what was his name? I'm forgetting the guy's name. Oh yes, Sigurd. Sigurd's. Their names are hard to pronounce, and I'm probably pronouncing them wrong. I'm honestly probably butchering them. But yeah, there's a lot of deep influences of all this stuff from the Lord of the Rings in this text. Let me just read an example to you of this. Here begins the tale and tales of a man who was named. I'm just going to pronounce it Siggy again. Probably pronouncing it wrong. It's Sigi. I have no idea how that's pronounced. So Siggy, and called of men, and the son of Odin, see, Norse mythology, gods. Another man withal is told of it in the tale. Heights, we'll just go with Scotty, but it's Skadi. I am terrible pronouncing names. A great man and a mighty of his hands. Yet was Siggy the mightier and the higher of kin, according to the speech of men at that time. Now Scotty had a thrall with whom the story must deal somewhat. Breedy by name. I'm guessing when they say thrall, they mean like son or brother or something like that. Anyways, Breedy by name, who was called after that work which he had to do in prowess and might of hand. He was equal to men who were held more worthy, yea, and better than some thereof. Now it is to be told that on a time Siggy fared to the hunting of the deer, and the thrall with him, and they hunted deer day long till the evening. And when they gathered together their prey in the evening, lo, greater and more by far was that which Breedy had slain than Siggy's prey. Now this is pay attention because this is where it gets good. And this thing he much misliked, and he said that great wonder it was that a very thrall should outdo him. So he was probably like a young man, boy probably, in the hunting of deer. So he fell on him and slew him, and buried the body of him thereafter in a snowdrift. Then he went home at evening tide, and says that Breedy had ridden away from him in the wild wood. Soon was he out of my sight, he says, and not more I know of him. Scotty misdoubted the tale of Siggy, and deemed that this was a guile of his, and that he would have slain Breedy. So he sent men to seek for him, and to such an end came their seeking that they found him in a certain snowdrift. Then said Scotty that men should call that snowdrift Breedy's drift from henceforth, and thereafter have folk followed, so that in such ways they call every drift that is right great. Thus it is well seen that Siggy had slain the thrall and murdered him, so he is given forth to be a wolf in holy places, and may no more abide in the land with his father. Therewith Odin bared him fellowship from his land. So a long way, the right long it was, and made no stay till he was brought him to certain warships. So Siggy falls lying out a warring with the strength of his father gave him or ever they parted, and happy was he in warring, and ever prevailed. Okay. So if you pay attention, that's very similar to Gollum's origin story. He was jealous, but for a different reason, of course. But they both have this thing of killing someone and then being cast out. And that's not, again, as I mentioned earlier, that is not a coincidence. That was deliberate. As I mentioned time and time again, there's many references of that I mentioned earlier with the dragon and so forth, and the gold, and how he had so much gold that everyone saw and wanted some of it, and so on and so forth. And they even exaggerated how much gold the guy that killed the dragon had, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's all these fascinating aspects that Tolkien literally references, I guess would be the best word to use, from the story, and probably the other stories of it, like the Elder Edda. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which does make sense. But the biggest and most fascinating thing I realized while reading this text was realizing that Tolkien was not writing a fantasy. He was writing a saga, especially with The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings is written in such a way it is not much different in text to this. There's a little difference in the language. The language is a little more, I don't want to say modern, but a little more accessible. That's the word I was looking for. The language in Tolkien's work is a little more accessible than in the Volsungs and the Niblungs, where the language at times it's still the same language, of course, but it's a little thicker. How do I put this? There's older words in the text that most people wouldn't pick up right away and have to take a moment to piece it together what that word is. Like, let me give you an example. they have something spelled wise, the wise of this person, which made no sense until you realize it's not wise, it's ways. It's the ways of so and so. And that was used quite a bit. They'd use wise as ways. And there's other such things like a drad. A drad? ADRAD. What the heck is. No, it's not a drad. It's a dread. DREAD. So there's little aspects of that in the text, and there's nothing like that in Tolkien's work because all the language is still fairly accessible to us today. It hasn't, you know, gotten to the point where the spelling of a single word is changed so drastically. So yeah, and you can see that in the entire story structure of the Lord of the Rings. You see the sort of the not the verse, the damn it, I'm forgetting the term. The text, how the text is written. Prose. That's what I was trying to say. God. How the prose is written in the Lord of the Rings is very similar to that, mixed in with elements of poetry and verse, which is very much the same as this story is. It'll have, mostly prose, stating things that happened, and then they'll have a random bit of verse or a lay here or there. In fact, I'll read you a poem real quick. Okay. Oh, here, this is a good example. Then said Loki, "What fish of all fishes swims strong in the flood, but hath learnt little wit to beware thine head? Must thou buy from abiding in hell, and find me in wane waters flame?" He answered, "And the very folk call Oyen my father. Over many a force have I fared, for a norn of ill luck this life on me lay, through what ways ever to wade." So, there's this interesting intermix of that. So you see that throughout, especially Lord of the Rings. And the fairy tale aspect in The Hobbit even isn't that far off from the Volsungs and Niblungs, as a lot of stories are written sort of like a fairy tale, though a bit different. And I'm going to get to that. I'll get to that. So yeah, that's it's just fascinating to see how Tolkien was influenced by works such as this, and how, unfortunately, today we all miss this. And this leads to my final point on the Tolkien thing, and then I'll just review Volsungs and Niblungs. So, the one tragic thing I think nowadays people miss out is they think fantasy is this single genre that has nothing to do with, say, epic poetry or fairy tales. They don't think fairy tales or epic poetry or fantasy as the same thing. They think of them as these separate entities, and they're not. They're not. They're all roots of the same tree that unfortunately have been severed and split off, and it's fractioned off to such a way that a lot of fantasy ain't even fantasy anymore. And it's because it's missing the fairy tales, it's missing the folk tales, it's missing the epic poetry, it's missing the epic, it's missing the sagas and so on. It's missing the whole roots of fantasy, which was rooted in the mythology. It was rooted in mythos. Anyways, now let's talk about the Volsungs and Niblungs. Okay, the Volsungs and Niblungs is structured in a very fascinating way. It is less of a normal, how should I put this? It's less of a straightforward single story as it is more of a collection of stories. It's about basically the Volsungs and the Niblungs. It's about the family of the Volsungs and Niblungs. It's about their very beginnings all the way to their end, their final ending, with the last of that tree family legacy dying out. And we see that played out. There's story after story from one generation to the next in the Volsungs and the Niblungs. And the stories are very different from one another in many ways. Let me tell you one of the stories. I'm just going to summarize one of the stories for you. So one of the stories, the one of the queens wanted a baby, but she wasn't having it at the moment. So they prayed to the gods, Odin and so forth, for a baby. Now, Odin sends off a messenger disguised as some bird who drops off an apple that's given to the woman so she can get pregnant. And she gets pregnant. This is where things get weird. She gets pregnant for 6 years. Yes, I said 6 years. She gets pregnant for 6 years. Her belly keeps getting bigger and bigger. She gets sick. She can't handle it much longer, and she basically asks for her belly to be cut open so the baby comes out just in time to kiss her on the forehead as she dies. You're going like, that's fucking brutal, and yeah, there's a lot of brutality like that. There's a whole sequence where they go Titus Andronicus on you towards the end, and one of the queens literally kills off basically her own children that she had with his later husband, and they basically feeds it cooks the children and feeds them to the husband. I'm not joking. That happens in the text. There's a lot of amazing, fascinating stuff like that. It's like, damn, it's really utterly fascinating. And there's obviously stories about battles. There's stories of fighting a dragon. There's a story about these werewolves. These are very actually they have an interesting approach to werewolves in this mythology than most. The werewolves are less a transformation sort of thing and more of a skin. Like there'd be this wolf skin that they would wear and be a wolf then. It's a very different approach to how we see werewolves now, where it's this sort of transformation and moonlight thing. And there's just all these different stories. There's so many. It's hard to talk about them all. But yeah, they're all fascinating and it's definitely worth the read. But if the text is like the one I have, you should take it slow with it and read like just a story a day, so you don't get too lost. But it is cool to see all the different epic fights that occur. I mean, there's one fight where both families are basically killing each other off left and right and just slaughtering each other. It's just man. And there's one time where they kill someone when he's asleep, and so they stab him in the dark at night. Actually, it's done a couple times. One time while they're fighting, when the one guy gets stabbed at night when he's asleep, he manages to grab his sword and throw it at him and cuts him in half. And his body falls apart in pieces. Yeah, it's well worth reading. And there's a lot of stuff like that throughout it. I don't want to give away too much of what happens because there's a lot to unpack, and it's definitely like I said, it's a story you want to take your time with, read it in little parts and sections. And as I said before, you gotta be wary of the language because with the translation I have, again, there's some English words that are there that are very old English. You kind of have to read the text as if it's at least with the one I have. You gotta read the text as if the person wrote it with a Scottish accent or an Irish accent or something like a Cockney accent. It's some thick, Irish accent kind of thing. The ways and lies and such and so. So yeah. Anyways, if you ever get the chance, try and read Volsungs and the Niblungs. I'm gonna try at some point to try and find the Elder Edda and try and read that. The sagas are just interesting, and yeah, it doesn't get enough credit, honestly. So yeah, that's all I gotta say. Bye, bye, bye.